Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. Today we have with us Patrizia Nava. Welcome.
Welcome, Patrizia.
Patrizia is an independent researcher. She has done a lot of research in the history of astrology, particularly in 17th century authors, and also in Cathartic astrology and the history of Cathartic astrology. She has a background on literature and philosopher, as her major and her main studies. So Patrizia, welcome again, and tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, please.
Yes, as you said very well before, my studies are in philosophy and literature, but I have always had a special interest in observational astronomy and in the history of astronomy as well. My interest in the history of astrology came later, in fact. I met Giuseppe Bezza, who was a scholar in the field of the history of astrology and taught for a couple of years at the University of Bologna. And as I have a background in Germanic philology, it was quite natural for me to take up the translations of my favorite author, that is William Lilly, especially his treatise in 3 volumes, Christian Astrology. So I would say that my special field of research is especially the history of Cathartic astrology in general, horary astrology in particular, but I am also very interested in the relationship between astronomy and astrology, especially during the early modern period. I mean, the astrology made by the astronomers. There are some very interesting examples of this, and I found it fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And please.
This is a very interesting topic. So the astronomy made by astrologers. So the astrology made by astronomers. Mm-hmm. So that relation between someone who is a scholar and a practitioner of astronomy and someone who studies. And this is a time where astronomy is really moving along and gaining a completely new status. But still, we have most of these large figures, which are also astrologers.
And the attitude was different during the time. I mean, we find some astronomers, such as Tycho Brahe, who really believed in what he did as an astrologer. There are other astronomers who made use of, for example, even of Cathartic astrology in their work, but without being so fond of it. And it is quite interesting to see, historically speaking, this development during the centuries. And also to see the persistence of Cathartic astrology during the centuries. I mean, when we speak of Cathartic astrology, we generally think of somewhat that could seem a primitive form of astrology, because it is sometimes related to magic, to other fields of that kind, talismanic magic in particular. But, it is also true that during the early modern period, a lot of scientists, and when I use this term, I mean in the modern common sense, made use of Cathartic practices in order to assure the positive outcome of their scientific institutions. For example, to found their astronomical observatories. Tycho Brahe was one of them. When he founded his astronomical observatory of Uraniborg, for example, he produced an electional chart for the right moment to lay the first stone of his observatory, and he believed completely in this practice. He was really convinced of it. And what is interesting is that in in the election chart for that moment, we can find almost the same, not exactly the same positions, but the same principles applied. We can see, for example, in the foundation chart of Baghdad, a lot of centuries before. So it was very, very traditional. For example, the position and the importance of a star such as Regulus, or a strong Jupiter at the ascendant. So the same principles were applied. Then, well, during the centuries, this changed, of course. Another astronomer, John Flamsteed, who was a great admirer of Tycho Brahe, decided to use Cathartic astrology to create an electional chart for his astronomical observatory, the Royal Observatory of Greenwich.
Yes,
and their attitude was different, of course, because, for example, John Flamsteed was not so sure that astrology had some truth in any case and in any situation. But he also said in his diaries that the impression of the stars, I'm quoting roughly, okay, the impression of the stars were so potently imprinted in the soul of human beings that it was impossible to deny any kind of influence on the part of the stars. So he decided to make use of the selectional chart in any case. The attitude, of course, is different, but it is interesting to see how Cathartic practices persisted even in the following centuries, in the modern era.
The persistence of a practice, even in different scientific contexts.
Yes, even in scientific contexts.
And in different mindsets, so with different mentalities, but still. And I'm curious about this. I think we have seen. I've never seen the election for Uraniborg, but I have seen for the observatory, I think.
Yes, I think so.
Did he follow the traditional rules, or did he just do something? I mean, for the observatory of Greenwich.
Yes, I think he followed the traditional rules. And also the presence of stars. For example, if I remember well, there is a Spica, a very beneficent star, exactly at the mid-heaven, and there are other features that are very similar to the election by Tycho Brahe. So I think that Tycho Brahe was somewhat a model for him. He tried to, in his own way, of course, with differences, to imitate, to emulate this great observer and astrologer. So there are some traditional features in that chart as well, yes.
Yeah. So the rules also persist, even in different times, in different contexts, but they would follow, they would root their practices in this tradition. And that's really good.
And I suspect in my own researches, which are within this time frame that you were talking, I believe that a lot of buildings might have similar elections, although we no longer have the record of those because when I find ceremonies described, and usually there's always a ceremony of the first stone, sometimes associated with a mass or a blessing or some kind of more standard religious activity, and usually the times are very precise, sometimes a little odd, and you can always suspect that there might have been something else other than just the religious.
And especially after the Great Fire of London in 1666, the reconstruction of the city, of the important monuments, of course, not of common houses, was based on this kind of elections. So there are some records. Sometimes it is not easy to have the right data, but we understand there is something, there is an election.
That would be a great research to spot all the monuments that were reconstructed with elections, and to build like a map Something that you can do.
Who knows? A research idea for
Yeah,
the
that
future.
would be a great project.
Yeah.
And also, we are talking about founding cities and also for buildings, important buildings, but also, and I found this very interesting because I had an example of this in the text that I studied in my PhD, and also then I found another example: elections for praying to God. I mean, like the priest advising a noble woman to pray only when the head of the dragon was in the midheaven, because that would be the moment where God would be more receptive. God and the saints would be more receptive to the prayer. So this is something, not only astrology mixing with what we now call science, but also living together peacefully with religion. That is so interesting because it would apply in several aspects of life.
Yes, even very common aspects of life. But in fact, if we look at even ancient texts about Catholic astrology, Dorotheus of Sidon, for example, or the medieval books about this, we often find very specific prescriptions for very common happenings. I mean, cutting one's own hair, or taking a bath, or very simple situations. And this is quite amusing and interesting, I think. Yes, it was part of common life, everyday life.
Yes, from the most important events to very basic common events, or even they would go so far as elections for conceiving a child, a male child or a female child. I would love to see if that works. We never know.
Or sometimes the opposite.
Or for not conceiving
a child.
So it's like contraceptive.
Yeah, contraceptive election, which is quite...
That would be for every aspect.
It was a useful practice, we could say. It was seen as a very useful practice, everyday life, and not only, of course, there is the important side, the noble side of it, foundation of cities, foundation of monuments, or any kind of important happening like that. But there was also something else for common people, perhaps.
Yes, everyday life, and for people that had less important tasks, but they were important for them. And also what we found in geography is that most cities, and I think it's the same in Italy, they have one sign or two signs associated. So could be something related also to this kind of election.
An ancient election that
something
made
that
in
was
memory.
lost.
Perhaps. In Italy, very often there is a connection between charts, electional charts, probably foundation charts, that are not always real charts, I think. I mean, we quite often find out that they are ideal charts for that city, and they not always correspond with what archaeology can tell us. But there is a branch in archaeology that is quite interesting as well, that is to try to date the ruins of cities, so the foundation of cities and monuments, by means of astronomical or even astrological considerations. So also that one could be a very interesting research. I'm interested in.
That would be a great project also.
Yes, indeed. We found out that, for example, Elena worked with a collection of charts in her PhD on several notable figures of France, 15th century France. And one thing that we noticed is that most of the times there is doubt on the date of birth or the year of birth, because historically there's no precise records. And then we find a chart And the chart, in a similar way, it can help us date a city, some astronomical observation or some astrological data. Also, a chart of a person that appears in the collection can also clarify exactly what is the date of birth for that figure.
And sometimes the place. Sometimes they don't know where the child was born. I mean, within France, but in which city, for instance. And there we can see from the chart where the birth.
The dates can tell you.
So dates and places.
Yes,
and
it's quite. It's a use of astrology in astrological data in historical reconstruction of events. I think that's also a wonderful branch to explore with all the data we have. And I was wanting to ask you, so you have centered, of course, also due to your studies, more on William Lilly and the English astrology of this period. But have you found equivalent practices in Italy, for example, or other places which you have focused on, or?
Well, of course, there are some very famous Italian astrologers who practiced the same kind of astrology. I mean, catachic astrology, or not only electional, but also horary astrology in particular. For example, Guido Bonatti. Guido Bonatti is one of the main sources of Lilly. Lilly had some books in his very rich library. And we can find very often not exactly quotations from Bonatti, but the same words, the same sentences reworded in some way, and we can see how Bonatti was actually important in forming Lilly's practice. Sometimes we see even that Lilly departs from his favorite template for oral questions, that is, to attribute the first house to the querent and the seventh house to the quesited person, in order to be faithful to Bonatti's opinion. For example, when Lilly says that when a woman is expulsed from the house of her husband, if she can return or not, and so on, then the seventh house represents the expulsed partner, the expulsed woman, even when the woman is the querent of the question. So he's going against his own beliefs, his own real, concrete practice of every day. And we can find this in Bonatti's work, in Decem Continens, Liber de Astronomia. So we have evidence of this. But this, I think, is quite interesting. Some astrologers, even practicing astrologers, have found out that Lilly is not always consistent in his use of houses. Sometimes he makes use of this, that I said is his favorite template. First house is always the querent, seventh house is the quesited person or the quesited thing, or any other house fit for purpose according to the nature of the person asked about or the thing asked about. But this is his template, and he is quite consistent in the use of it, generally speaking. But sometimes he shifts to a different use, to the use of the first house for the person quesited, or the thing requested. And this is quite puzzling sometimes, because it happens inside the same chapters about the same topic, in paragraphs that are very similar the one to the other. So we wonder why this change. But I think that the reason for this is historical. It is not a technical reason. I mean, I respect practicing astrologers who try to find a rationale in this shifting of houses and try to be faithful to Lilly in using the first house in this case and the seventh house in the other. But I don't think that this is completely satisfactory, because I think that the real reason is, as I said before, historical, and comes from the historical transformation of inceptional and electional material into questions properly called, especially in the course of the Middle Ages. So we can see this passage, if we think, for example, of Dorotheus of Sidon. I'm mainly interested in early modern practice, as I said before. But it is true that astrology is a very traditional discipline. So it's impossible to study Lilly, for example, or any kind of later author properly without studying at the same time the sources. And the sources are in the past. So, for example, Dorotheus of Sidon is an important source for Lilly as well. Although, to be sure, Lilly, of course, never mentions Dorotheus. There is no Carmen in his library because there was no complete translation into Latin or no extant tradition at the time, if ever existed. I don't think so in any case. But there is an indirect transmission of Dorothean material we can find in Christian astrology, of course, by means of medieval authors, especially Arabic authors, such as Sahal bin Bishr, both for questions and elections, or Abu Ali al-Khayyat, especially for native material, or even through Bonatti, or Ali Aben Rajal, for example, that is a very important source for Lilly. He quotes
literal.
Continuously, yes, literal. Sometimes Lilly makes mistakes because he quotes from an edition he possessed of Ali Aben Rajal that contained some mistakes, and he reproduces them, although they are not present in other editions of previous editions of Ali Aben Rajal, for example. So we have evidence of this process of almost copying from some works. So through these authors, we have an indirect influence of Dorotheus of Sidon, even on Christian astrology. For example, I give just an example. The choice of significators in questions about relationships and marriage. Well, Lilly says, for the man who is the querent, you have to use the first house, the lord of the first house, a natural significator for all men, that is the sun, and the planet from which the moon is separating. For the woman, quasitive, you have to use the seventh house, the lord of the seventh house, a general significator that is Venus in this case, and the planet to which the moon is applying. Well, these words are present in Canon Astrologicum, Dorotheus of Sidon. So they are exactly the same. Of course, Lilly couldn't read those words in that work, but they are present in Bonatti as well. They are present in Sahal bin Bishr as well. So by means of other medieval authors, Dorothean material or Dorothean-like material came into the practice even of early modern authors, later authors such as Lilly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, yes. We always have this opinion, and as you read more sources and we explore sources, that there is indeed, how shall I put this, a nucleus of practices and concepts that remains, a core, that remains practically constant since earlier authors like Dorotheus until very late authors like William Lilly, and you can follow a thread into them, and you connect them like you are stating, and that becomes very clear. And then you have extras or specific practices that vary a little bit from this core, but there is a central core that we can more or less follow throughout the millennia.
Or even if it's not specifically a technique, we can follow the idea. The concept is there, sometimes expressed in a way, sometimes expressed in another form, but the concept is there.
It travels.
If we read enough authors, and we can abstract a little bit the idea from the literal meaning, we see that these concepts actually travel, as you said, throughout time, and they remain more or less unchanged. And then the way they are applied changes throughout different places, cultures, and periods. But the concept, it's there and remains there. So this is something that we are very invested in doing. This is what we study, the history of concepts throughout time. And it is so interesting to see this, because I always say it's like having, the concept is like having the same face, but throughout time it has different makeups, different ways of expressing itself. But you can see through the makeup, and you can see that it's still there. So it's so interesting. But you are not only studying Lilly, you are also translating Lilly.
Yes,
I would like. So please, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I am translating his Christian Astrology. I'm publishing it with Agora. I'm translating it into Italian. I think it is an important work. I think it is, of course. Because there was no such a translation in Italy. There was before only a translation of the modified and completely changed version of Zadkiel Morrison from the 19th century. And even in the astrological world, they generally think that is Lilly, but it is not so. The original by Lilly is completely different, and the principles are mostly different, and a lot of details are different, and not only the details. So I decided to translate the original, and I'm comparing the two different editions, because there are only two editions of Christian Astrology that were authorized by Lilly himself. One is of 1647 and the other of 1659. Then there is this edition of the 19th century by Morrison that is, of course, amended, as he said, ameliorated, as he said, really modified, deprived, I think. And I'm comparing all these three editions in order to have a clearer picture of the original on one side and of the transmission of it by means of other astrologers of the following centuries who modified a lot of techniques in order to produce something that was more palatable, I think, for a Victorian audience. So this passage could be interesting to examine.
Yes.
But what I think it is really fascinating from my point of view of historical research in this field is that historical research can help you understand the techniques and can give you the reason why some techniques are there, even when they are a bit puzzling, as I said before, about the use of different houses in the same context, after all. And at the same time, the presence of certain techniques in certain works can give you evidence of the transmission, historical transmission. So it is a twofold influence, study of history on one side and the study of the techniques, I think that they must go together. It is necessary.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
Undoubtedly. And I think what makes William Lilly's work so important, well, once a way it's simple, it's in English, so it's something that has it's much easier to read for the modern researcher. You don't need to go into a language that you have to study and to really know in order to access it. Of course, that's probably the first, but it's also, I think, he has this, as you were saying, this transmission of many sources from Arabic and earlier one that come with the Arabic, and he does this preservation and synthesis of sources, which make him, I think, at the same level as a treatise of like Bonatis or a treatise like Sal. It has that kind of consistency in a period where you will find that most treatises, and this I'm coming out from my research, which is centered on the Iberian world and also a little bit of Italy, where the practice was already there were a lot of changes and strictures being applied to the practice. So, and for example, so Arabic sources were no longer used or accepted
at
as
least
much
openly.
At least openly. And Lilly doesn't have that problem. He's making a concise manual, following up as much of the tradition as he has absorbed and decided to transmit, while in other places you already see a more poor version, if we can use this word, of the tradition, because depleted of all this quantity and richness of content, because there has already been censorship. There is a filtering of Arabic sources in some cases, and it doesn't have the same power, I think, as Lilly's work has, and it's not as complete as Lilly's work is.
Okay, it is very relevant to do this, and I think you had already translated the two first parts.
Yes.
So you mean the introduction and then the big chunk on horary. That's the big part. So you need now to go for nativities.
Yes.
But the big one is the second one, isn't it?
Yes, the second one.
It is
done. All the examples and so on. It is interesting to, as I said before, try to find, while translating, a rationale for his choices, and very often you can find it in past sources. Actually, I don't know if it is really a choice on the part of Lilly. Very often it is simply faithfulness to the tradition, or respect rather for the tradition, although he is always able to say what he really thinks after all. Yes, I mean, for example, even in his attitude towards Ptolemy, we can find this double attitude, perhaps. I think that certainly the so-called back to Ptolemy movement of the Renaissance influenced Lilly as well. And in fact, for example, in an almanac of 1644, it is England's Prophetical Merlin of 1644, he states that his aim in writing Christian Astrology and then publishing it is to make some pieces of Ptolemy speak English. So there is this respect towards Ptolemy, of course, and also when he has to make a choice between different techniques, he generally stands by Ptolemy. For example, the calculation of the part of fortune, that is the Ptolemaic one and not the Hermetic one, not the Dorothean one, or the choice of Ptolemaic bounds instead of Egyptian bounds. Or, for example, he doesn't use Dorothean triplicities, but the simplified version of Ptolemy. This is true. But it is also true, I think, this is my opinion, that we should not overdo this influence by Ptolemy, because after all, Lilly seems to be very faithful to traditional authors, but he's quite an independent figure after all. He states in a very direct way in the same almanac, he says that it is not important for him if Ptolemy was against horary astrology. He defends his practice of horary against Ptolemy's indifference. In fact, Ptolemy didn't speak about horary astrology, of course, in his treatise Tetrabiblos. But he says that there are two possible answers to this problem, two possible solutions, says Lilly in the Almanac. He says, one is, if the Centiloquium was actually written by Ptolemy, then the problem is solved, because a lot of aphorisms in the Centiloquium are devised for horary questions. But if, and here he is very aware of the problem, I think, if the Centiloquium was not written by Ptolemy, then this doesn't matter, because horary astrology is a practice that works, because Ptolemy is in the past, I am in the present. Astrology has developed in the meanwhile, so there is no reason to disregard or to discard horary astrology only because Ptolemy was against it. And even in his third book, Christian Astrology, about nativities, here we can see the Ptolemaic influence more clearly. Of course, Ptolemy is one of his main sources for that third book, and almost only for that third book, actually. But he says, probably my readers will accuse me of criticizing Ptolemy or disregarding his teaching. And I admit, I'm doing this. I'm departing from Ptolemy, he said, because I think it is more important to rely on reason and experience rather than experience of a single man. And he also adds, I'm not the first astrologer to do so, to depart from Ptolemy, and I will not be the last one. So he's quite independent after all. He respects very highly the traditional sources, but when he has doubts about something, he states it very, very clearly and directly.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, he has critical thought.
Yes.
And also he had experience, extensive practical experience, so he relies also in his own practice and his own experience. That's very interesting.
Yes.
And these two things can coexist: the respect for the tradition and then his experience. So the one thing does not take out the other; just they coexist. That is a very interesting thing.
Yeah, and what I think it is very clear is that he has. Well, we were talking about there are all these changes, and he uses the Ptolemaic calculation for the part of fortune, Ptolemaic bounds. But I think that's a result of the practice of his time, because he was already living at a time where you have at least 1 century, if not a little bit more, of a complete change in the way that the essential dignities were experienced. All this return to Ptolemy was quite embedded at this practice. So so he's quite using a line of work which is modern and is contemporary to him, or a little bit, or 1 or 2 generations before him. So that is the natural continuation. But then, as you were saying, he adds a lot of other more traditional sources to it, which is not as common, for example, in other 17th century books or even 16th century books, where they're doing their own thing, and he's quoting a lot of Arabic tradition.
So it's a bit like a second wave.
It's sort of a second wave, if we can say it like this, where other traditional elements, older traditional, are again coming into to his work, while other authors don't do that.
Well, this is why it's so interesting. this is why it's so interesting that we can study the techniques throughout time, because we see how they develop and how they change and sometimes return. So that is the interesting part. Well, I look forward for your work and for your last part, last section of the translation. And of course, the next thing I'm going to say is, will you translate the almanacs? Because it comes like in a natural sequence.
Yes. There are some of them that are quite interesting, but they are also full of material that perhaps is a bit difficult to propose to the public, if not an academic public, because they are less consistent they speak about several very different topics in each almanac. So, but it could be
It's an idea.
project. This as well, yes. Thank you for the suggestion.
Well, it's always he has a lot of good material there. I think perhaps not all almanacs, but I think he has a lot of mundane, for example, material in the almanacs which he doesn't deal with in Christian astrology and can perhaps complement.
Very revealing, and it's also revealing about his views, more personal views, and maybe that would be the way to go, like to see William Lilly and his context, political, cultural, maybe, I don't know.
Exactly. I think that the only practice that is somewhat lacking in his work is the election practice. And this is quite strange if you consider that, after all, horary astrology was a later development of electional and cathartic astrology and inceptional astrology. But there is a reason for this. For example, in Christian astrology, Lilly says he has not the slightest intention to deal with electional astrology, but not because it is not valid, but because he thinks that any clever astrologer who studied his work thoroughly would be able to produce any kind of electional chart about any kind of subject with no problem at all. And this is interesting because he seems to be aware of one historical fact, that although electional astrology and horary astrology have completely different purposes, of course, because one aims at solving a specific question, a specific problem in understanding or foreseeing the possible outcome of a situation, and the other instead is searching for the most auspicious moment for an enterprise, any kind of action. At the same time, as far as the techniques and the principles involved are concerned, they are, according to Lilly at least, actually the same. So he treats them as if they were the same. And this is probably due to his experience, not to his historical awareness. But it is quite fascinating, I think, to find that this connection, this kinship between these different practices is real and historical. We can find evidence of this.
That's very interesting. Like two faces of the same coin for him.
Yeah, faces of the same coin. Exactly.
Yeah, and I also like to see the book and the almanacs, because you see different facets of Lilly, and he's more, I would say, he's more revealing in the almanacs, but also in the book we can see, especially in certain examples, we can see his political views and his views toward religion. We can see him in the book also. So it is interesting. I hope that some editor will find this interesting, because that would be also a very good project. That would be a very good.
Really?
Let's see.
Well, Patrizia, thank you very much for sharing all of this with us. I think you're doing very interesting work, because not only the translation, but the translation is also allowing you to really understand where the lineage of thinking that goes into this work is coming from. And I think that's highly valuable in such a work. And I think because you're translating, you have to be very aware of this fine detail. It's not the same as reading it. You have to really go into it. So it's giving you a lot of good information, and I hope you can also publish later, perhaps, papers on this kind of approach and on this analysis, which I think is also quite interesting for such an important author, at least in terms of the positioning of astrology at this period, because I think he's almost our last example of a complete practitioner at this point.
Yeah, he's a very late example.
Yeah, so there are others, of course, but he is a central player in this period. Yeah, so I hope you'll be able also to address those details in specific papers. And I thank you very much. We thank you very much for joining us.
Very interesting. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to debate about very interesting things, I think.
Yes, thank you. Yes. And we hope to talk again soon.
Yes.
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not?
Thank you.